Well, hello, Freedom. Pastor Jeremy here, and I want to welcome you all to another episode of We Need to Talk. Today, I'm sitting down with my good friend, Pastor and Dr. Dan Hyun of the Village Church. Man, it's good to have you with us. How you doing, Pastor Dan?
I'm doing good. It's really good to be together with you, brother.
Good, man. I'm glad to have you, and thank you so much for stopping by for this episode of We Need to Talk. Pastor Dan, man, it's a lot going on in our nation right now, right? I mean, we just came through a pandemic, an election. We had some social injustice last year, and we turn on our news today and we see that we have even more injustice going on in our country. There's this recent, I don't know if it's a recent uprise or just more recent coverage of the bad treatment and violence and hatred towards Asian Americans. And so, Pastor Dan, we need to talk.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so thanks again for dropping by, man. I just want to talk to you about this subject. It's very near and dear to our heart. You're our brother. We love you. We love our brothers and sisters at the Village Church, and we certainly love our Asian and American brothers and sisters in Christ as well. Man, first of all, before we get into this, Pastor Dan, I know that when we say Asian American, that is such a big umbrella, okay, and covers probably more than one culture, if I'm not mistaken. Could you help us to understand, when we talk about Asian American, what are we talking about in terms of cultures, ethnicities, and what are we covering?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a real valid point, because I think just in trying to provide coverage, you have to use some terms. So Asian American is a really large, encompassing, but even within that, even within Asian Americans, you realize it's not a monolith. Mm-hmm. So you have Southeast Asians, South Asians, East Asians, and within those different cultures, I think from an American point of view, it's all the same. But obviously, you dig in a little bit and you'll have just differences in appearance, but I would say even within the American story, significant differences even in class, socioeconomic status, things that where the larger narrative might lump a whole group of people into one. You're going to find a lot of diversity in that. So, but for the sake of all the coverage of what's going on, Asian American is pretty good, because a lot of different peoples are experiencing this even within the one Asian American demographic.
Yeah, I appreciate that, man. Thank you for breaking that down for me. I got to hear you speak a few years ago at Freedom's Unplugged. And you shared a lot about your Asian experience, Asian American experience here growing up in the United States. And I'm not sure that a lot of people at Freedom have got to hear that story. So, man, if you wouldn't mind, just tell us a little bit about what it was like for you growing up in the States as an Asian American, from a childhood even up until now.
Yeah, so I'm Korean American. So for me, I was born and raised in the States. I joke with my kids now, because they're Korean American like I am, but it's vastly different, where they're going to school and they're talking about their non-Asian friends bringing like little seaweed snack packs, and I guess that among like the bougie folk, that's like kind of healthy snacks. I'm like, what? And they're like, yeah. And you got Korean K-pop music or K-dramas, BTS, Samsung phones, and I'm like, yo, it's almost cool to be Korean now.
Right.
People love the Korean fusion and appropriating all our food, and But the thing is, I think part of my journey is it was very not cool to be Asian American, specifically Korean American, growing up, and part of it was I just didn't have that as many of people like me from where I was growing up, and I think at that time there was a real struggle with identity, and the reality is that. I'm coming up on 50 now, and I'm still processing some of that, maybe even more, because I'm seeing some of those issues of identity have really formed deeply, where I didn't like who I was. And, when you don't see value in who you are represented, you start to question if you're a mistake. So part of my experience, and this is just real broadly, is I tried to do my best to not be identified as an Asian American. And if anything, it was almost an elevation of larger culture for me, which was more white culture. Like, I wanted to be fitting in very much. I didn't, like, I'm Asian, and I would even make jokes about it. So I look back and a little cringy now, where people, they make jokes about who you are, and you just kind of laugh along, because you're just like, oh, I'm part of the group, and inside you're not a fan of it, but it's you don't want to stir things up. So I think part of my struggle was embracing who I was, and that lasted a long while, and it's even had repercussions into who I am today, and just not really appreciating the design that God has made me in, and so the things I had in childhood, bringing it more into more modern life, and I think I've shared this with a few people, but an example of that was I viewed who I was as an Asian American as a liability. It wasn't beautiful. I liked certain aspects of it, but I saw it as something that wouldn't help me really achieve or get to where I wanted to within a larger American culture, specifically a white dominant culture. So when we first started our church, The Village, and I cringe when I say this, every cool church planter, they have an epic website, and usually what do? You prominently display the lead pastor, lead planter. We had no pictures or my name anywhere on that, because in my mind, I wanted to reach a multi-ethnic, multicultural type of population. I didn't want to be known as an Asian or Korean church. And in my mind, if people see that the pastor is Korean, they're not going to come. And so those were kind of the underlying self-hatred.
Wow.
And that sounds like a strong word, but as I've dug into it more, there was a self-hatred of who I was, and I had to compensate. I had to be like a unicorn. I had to be better just to make it.
Yeah. Wow. Man, that's so interesting. I definitely didn't know about that part about the website, man. And when you talk about that kind of self-hatred and fitting in and those things, certainly some parallels to the African American experience. So sympathize, but empathize at some levels as well, man.
Well, that's the really interesting thing, and there's been so much intersection in my own journey with the and again, when we say Black journey, it's not a monolith,
right? Exactly.
As an Asian American, especially as a male, one of the things I struggled with was feeling this idea that you're weak. Everyone looks at you as weaker. And even now with some of the violence, that's some of the strong. Like, people feel like they can take advantage of you. And that was definitely because you're quieter, you fall into this model minority understanding, and most people call it a myth. But and this is really stereotypical, and I see that it's formed in an incorrect understanding, but I used to almost envy Black friends or Black people, because I felt like, people might be racist, but they scared of Black people. I would rather be feared. I wish I were like that. Because even if I don't fit in, I'd rather people be afraid of me, because they're not afraid of me. They actually make fun of me.
Wow.
And I don't want that. I'd rather be like that.
Wow. It's so interesting you say that, because as an African American male, some of the stereotypes that maybe African Americans and maybe even Caucasian brothers and sisters had of Asian Americans was they're smart. They good at math and things of that nature. Matter of fact, I even was talking recently about with a friend about my upcoming relocation and changing schools and stuff like that with the kids, and they were kind of telling me how having Asian Americans in a certain part of the population boosts the math scores for that. And so we grew up with these type of stereotypes and things as well, and we had that ethnic envy, if you will, as well, but for different reasons. It's so interesting to hear you say that. Well, Pastor Dan, let me ask you a question, man. I mean, because hearing how you grew up, right? And even not just in today's talk, but before, when I've heard previous story and testimony before, and then hearing this, how your kids are it's kind of different. Now it's kind of cool where they're hanging out and everything like this. Yet we're seeing what appears to be this uptick in hatred or violence or mistreatment towards Asian Americans. And again, I'm intentionally keeping it general. Man, is this something that is just now getting media coverage? Is this something that has been going on? I mean, because if they're doing okay, if your kids are doing okay, and kind of being Korean is kind of Korean American's kind of cool right now. Why are we starting to hear so much about this? Why are we starting to see so much about this right now?
Yeah. Well, and to clarify, even when I say my kids, like, I'm saying their life is cool. They've definitely struggled with their identity.
I see.
Especially as being Asian American children being raised in Baltimore City, where they're very much the minority, and they've heard stuff in school. They've received messages that they don't fully belong. The one trope that every Asian American, no matter how good your English might be, that you hear, hey, where are you from?
Yeah.
Like Chicago. No. Where are you from?
Right.
And my kids, they're Baltimore born and raised, but they're gonna hear that, and for me to prep them. So they've definitely wrestled. I would say with some of these instances, though, again, we're going by reports that we hear. It seems like there has been a dramatic upsurge in anti-Asian hate and racism. Sometimes, and statistics are hard because some of the challenges, you don't know what's actually being reported. So some have said, maybe this was always there, but people just Asians tend to culturally not bring things out. They'll internalize.
Okay.
So maybe the media is just kind of inflaming some of this, and I tend to believe that the media can dictate certain narratives. But the thing is, I think with some of these issues, and recently, I think in the past couple of weeks, obviously it's become much more mainstream. But a lot of this wasn't driven by the media. So I don't know if we can say that the media has kind of like inflamed this, even though I know that's a common argument from some.
Sure.
I don't think that was the case because we weren't hearing much about it, but I was, because I'm Asian American.
Yeah.
And you tend to recognize how collective of a culture are you, because if something happens, say on the other end of the coast, you hear about it.
Yeah.
Even if mainstream NBC, they're not saying anything, you hear about it. So I tend to believe there has been an increase, and by all sort of reporting factors, there tend to be. I think what we're starting to see, though, is the actual violent instances, that's starting to dramatically increase. And I don't know if it's, there's probably a lot of factors involved with it. Some of it is a copycat effect, just the way human nature is. When you see something happen, people tend to repeat those actions, for good or for bad. But I think one thing that we're seeing, and a lot, especially out of Atlanta, with the tragedy that occurred there, I think one thing that I'm noticing among some, and a lot of Asian Americans, again, not everyone feels like this, but a lot, is this is not brand new. Maybe some of these incidents are, but the racism that Asian Americans felt, for some, it's their whole life.
Wow.
And what I'm noticing is a lot of people, it's almost this like volcano that's come up within them, because again, the Asian American story, and you get this from your parents, is you just don't cause a stir. Put your head down, because no one's going to look out for you. You just get it done. You just be the best. You succeed. If no one's going to look out for you, but you can make it happen, but don't cause a stir. So many I know, they've just, even if they've experienced stuff, they say, well, what's it going to help to make a big deal out of it? But what Atlanta did was it just brought it all out to the surface. And it breaks my heart to hear some people, just their stories, and a lot of people are just sharing stories of their whole life of being felt like the perpetual foreigner. And I think that's one thing about being Asian American, that it might not be overt violence all the time. And just to be real, if you go about odds, like I'm worried what could happen to my wife or my daughters, but the odds are it's probably not going to be like a violent incident. But just the fact that it's out there, it creates something. But it's understanding that racism is not just a violent action. It's a thought, it's a ethos, it's a mentality. Because one of the common things you've been hearing recently, depending on the bent, is, well, Asians can't experience racism because they're all smart, they're all succeeding, they're all getting rich, they all go to the best schools. We got to keep them out of the best schools. How the heck can we say they're victims of racism when they're doing better than everyone else? And I think it's a really pagan understanding of what success looks like. Because you can achieve, and I would say even the achievements at a certain level, but you'll still receive some of what it means to be marked by how people perceive you to be, just based on your race and ethnicity.
Wow, man, that's so insightful. I want to ask you something, a follow-up to what you said earlier, because I think we, again, share a parallel or similar experience in the African American community. When we see things like police involved shootings and things like that, statistics, it's not likely that it's going to happen. But yet, because it's out there, it's like a little cringy if an officer is behind me, maybe the best officer in the world. My dad was an officer, and so I know a lot of good ones are out there. But you still get that just because it happened. So my question to you, Pastor Dan, is, man, what how would you describe the general sentiment of the Asian American community as far as you're involved in it? I know you can't speak for all Asian Americans living in the United States right now, or even abroad, because this is bigger than just the United States. My understanding this is happening abroad as well. And so for the United States, though, what would you say the sentiment? Are Asian Americans scared right now, frustrated, disappointed, angry? What would you say the overall sentiment? All of the above? What's the overall sentiment right now?
I mean, I think it's a lot of all of that.
Yeah.
There's definitely a lot of fear, and you know, obviously, as people who believe in the gospel, we want to encourage people to not live by fear, because you know, we're taught to have faith, not fear. But I think there's a justifiable sense of concern, maybe even not for yourself. Because I'll be straight. I mean, for real, someone could come up. I mean, you try to do something like, you know, let's take a. But I'm thinking about others, those in my congregation, my elderly mother, or my wife, or my daughters, or you know, that's who I'm thinking of, and whether it's justified or not, whether it's even rational or not, you just think it. I think there's a lot of anger, a lot of sadness. I think. And maybe this is even projecting my own self. I think it's a certain disappointment or anger, maybe, of even within Christian circles. And this is some of my journey. I think it was always the idea, you know, and for me, I almost took an intentional route not to be lumped in as just an Asian American. And just even say that. Asian Americans are the only ones who are going to like complain that the church is getting too Asian American, for instance. Like, there's this sense of unworth almost. But I think even for me, who's kind of achieved certain things as a Korean American within non-Korean spaces, I think the past couple of weeks especially, it really revealed, man, we're kind of invisible. I mean, I gotta be honest, brother, when you reached out and say, hey, I'd like to talk about this, I mean, I was getting the feels, because I can count on one hand, less than one hand, the number of non-Koreans or non-Asians who've reached out and say, hey, how you doing?
Wow.
And I fully understand that, because especially for Anglo brothers and sisters, it's not that they don't care, I don't think. It's just, it's such an individualistic mindset. It's like, if you're white, you're not going to get suddenly proud if someone across the country does something great just because they're white. I mean, that sounds ridiculous. Like, why would, or you're not going to grieve, you might feel sad, but you're not going to feel it unless they're like your family. But I think especially for people of color, minorities, like if you're black, you kind of get it.
Right.
Because there's a sense you're part of a culture, a subculture maybe even, and definitely for Asian Americans. And I think part of the Asian American experience that many are lamenting right now is even within Christian cultures, where you've been told you're loved, you're embraced, hearing like a silence, whether it's politically motivated or not, but hearing this overall silence, even when you've expressed your pain. And I think that's really hurtful for a lot. And I preached on it, so it's out there.
Sure.
It's been really hurtful for me. Because you hear people say, we're with you, but then you start to question, are you really with me? Because if you're with me, you would feel some of my pain, but I don't hear that. At least I don't hear anything. And I'm not even talking about social media stuff, because whatever that is.
Right.
But just even reaching out, personally, it's been very lacking.
Man, let me stay there for a minute. You got the reaching out, right? Absence, silence. But this is one thing that has concerned me. Let's talk about advocates, right, for a moment. Allies, right? My question was, where were the rallies? Where were the protests? Where was the anything, right? And I don't know, maybe because there's no system, I guess, involved in this, or perceived to be involved with this. There's nothing to protest against, I don't know. But I was just surprised at the lack of just anything. Like what I saw, what I see more than anything when I turn on the news and watch this, is our Asian American brothers and sisters mourning. I don't see what I saw with George Floyd. I don't see what I saw with Breonna Taylor. I don't see what I saw with Ahmaud Arbery. And I'm just wondering, man, you know, what is it going to take for us to see like everybody?
And I would say, I think some of that, and I think it's just so complex. I think justifiably some of the in my experience, some of the greatest advocates and allies have been black brothers and sisters. Honestly. because I think there's a shared sense of understanding lament.
Sure.
But I mean, just to be truthful, I think there's also been complex pushback from some in the Black community, and not often Christians, saying, well, why should we care about Asians who've never cared about us? You know, if anything, they treat us like less than human. Why would we? Why are they getting on our back all at, you know, our hundreds of centuries of, and now they want to jump on and kind of claim persecution and suffering? No, heck no. You all do your own thing. So I think there's been that, and I think that it should give pause to Asian American communities who are like, why aren't people standing with us? To honestly ask, well, how much have you been standing for others as well? I think that those are just very real, and again, it's not dismissing, because even during the civil rights movement, you just don't hear about it. There were a good number of Asian American activists who stood with Black brothers. You just don't hear it,
right?
Because the narrative is, oh, Black and Asian people don't like each other. They've always been at each other. Well, actually, no. There are some who actively walked with that, but in my opinion, not enough. And Asian Americans, one thing this is a horrible season, but I always believe God's moving, and one of the ways I feel His Spirit breathing is creating a solidarity among the Black and, again, larger Black and larger Asian communities to engage in some hard conversations, but to really also stand together one another and see how much more we have in common than even what the larger narrative might push forward. Because, you know, even we had a rally this past weekend. Some of the strongest voices from some of the Asian Americans, and mainly women, who were speaking out was, we need to actually stand harder for other peoples other than just Asians. We can't just get mad if it's just something that happened to Asians. That's not Christ. We need to stand for all people. And just even one African American brother who stood as an ally, just speaking very powerfully. I think, just the way of the world is you're expected to stand up for yourself. You're expected to protest for yourself, but when you stand for others who the world says you have nothing to do with, that's where gospel truth starts to penetrate. And I feel some of that happening. Not enough in the larger world, but at least within these respective communities.
You said two things in that I want to pick up on. Number one, you talked about the conversation, just the conversation happening, right? And I want to dig into that because you've done some stuff in this area to help us with the Ethnos conference. And so if you could just expound on like what you have actually done, because it's one thing to complain and say, well, we're being mistreated, and then you go back and then the next incident, we're being mistreated, and you go back and then 3 years later, another incident. But you've actually done stuff about this. And one of those great things you've done is the Ethnos conference, centered around racial reconciliation, around the gospel and so forth. So tell us a little bit about that, if you don't mind, man, and how that has helped move this conversation forward.
Well, things like Ethnos, and Ethnos hopefully is not just an event, but it's really, for me, it was an overflow of just my own journey, because I mean, part of my testimony, I was just flat out racist. I was equal opportunity. I didn't like white people. I didn't like Black people. I didn't even like other Asian people. You know, I was just really a hateful, angry person. But some of God's like kind of Damascus Road work in me was using that to really break me and kind of lead me to a transformative experience. And you know, for me, even when, I don't know if others do this, maybe I don't know if I should say this on camera because it makes me sound more pagan, but sometimes I'll wrestle with, do I really know Christ? Because I look at my life, I'm like, But where I find hope that something genuine has happened is where I used to have so much hate and anger and enmity towards others, especially of other ethnicities. There's like genuine love now. It's like family. Like I look at you, I mean, it's not even like a funny, like, oh, we're brothers, and no, like it's like real family. I'm like, that's the work of Christ, because I can't produce that, because I know the kind of hate I used to have. So Ethnos and other things, I think it's just an overflow of that, and that, again, some people poo-poo things like conferences or whatnot, but for me, any chance that we have to bring people together to live out some of the love publicly, because I believe it makes a statement. I'm just a proponent of that. So we've tried to really, and you know, back when I was in Philly, but obviously now in Baltimore, which is my home, is try to push forward as much as the riches I've experienced cross-culturally in allowing us to walk that journey together and realize part of God's work in us as a larger people, we need one another. If we don't have one another, especially in the just the shattered world that we live in right now, we need to model Christ's work in this way.
Man, I'll tell you, Ethnos was way more for an event, maybe more than an event for me. I know that, and I remember individual speakers, man, and what they brought to the table, and that's had a profound impact on me. So thank you so much for that vision and allowing God to use you in that, and all those who worked with you during those years. Now, Ethnos, but then you also mentioned allies, and I got to see some of the rally, got to watch that on Facebook from some of the village family that went over as well. I want to ask you, what does it look like in light of what we've talked about so far? What does it look like to be an ally? What does it look like for African American brothers and sisters, white brothers and sisters, Hispanic brothers and sisters? You know, what does it look like for us to be, you know, an ally? What does it actually look like?
I mean, if I would boil it down, it's standing for someone as if they were your own flesh and blood. And you know, I think it's always a tenuous kind of dynamic, because most people think of allies in kind of a social media way, and I think that's valid. I know some people really dismiss it as not real. Well, I mean, we live in a media-driven world. And so for me personally, if someone says, you know, that's not real work, I don't do social media, and if they're never on social media themselves, I'm like, cool, you know. But it's more the people who are under a lot and have something to say about everything else, but then you hear nothing about particular things. I think that sends a message. So I think just in a very elemental kind of step, just being an ally is making your voice heard. And I'll be honest, I think especially for our white brothers and sisters, some of them, to be an ally, it's not courageous, I don't think, but it is a cost to say some things, because in the circles that they're in, it will provide them pushback more than it would for me or a black brother or sister say so, because people just expect us to say it, because that's just our struggle. But if you're white, there is a certain step of being an ally and just publicly. So whether people say it's shallow because it's social media, well, I think there's something there, but I think on a more substantive relational level, it's taking those more public things, but also being that love your neighbor level with those who, especially those who you walk with. And most people, it's going to be rare to go to like a complete stranger and say, hey, can I be your friend because I want to be your ally? That might feel weird, but hopefully most of us have some kind of sense of relationships with someone who might be of a different culture. And don't just assume things. You know, ask them, like, how are you processing this? And they might tell you, well, I'm not processing anything, because just because I'm Asian, it doesn't mean I'm cool. But at least you asked. And I think taking the effort to do that, and I mean, we know this in church, right? We just always assume with people, I don't want to impose on them. I don't want to like bother them when they're grieving or whatnot. What do most people say? Oh, man, people have just kind of ghosted me. And I think that can hurt as much as anything. So sometimes we think of an ally as a very kind of like activist, kind of like on the steps of the Capitol. Well, maybe not Capitol.
Not recently.
But I think it can also, maybe those things are very valid, but it can also be on a very relational, interpersonal level, letting those, you know, Jesus was a relationally present Messiah. In the same way, how can we do that with others who we have relationship with already?
So that, I appreciate that, and you kind of spoke to both the individual and then bled into some church ideas as well. Man, what's the church's role right now? Especially if perhaps, say a church like Freedom, where we are blessed and fortunate to have Asian American congregants, but we're not, you know, predominantly Asian American, right? Or even perhaps some of the churches who are majority culture this, majority culture that, and may have no Asian American congregants or attenders at this time. Man, what do you think it looks like for us as churches to come alongside the Asian community and show love and to be there, do what Christ told us to do as a church?
I mean, it's complex, because there is a certain slippery slope. Well, if we address everything, where does it stop? You know, how can we like our whole service every week could be taking care of the problem of the week that day.
Right.
But I do think there is a sense for the church where we don't just exist for the majority who make up our communities.
It's good.
But we start to recognize how hard it is to be a minority within a church. And just to be very frank, post-Atlanta, it was almost a litmus test, whether it's fair or not, of people, Asian Americans who were part of majority non-Asian churches say, how did your church address this, if anything? Did they preach about it? Did they pray about it? Did they even talk about it? Did they say sorry? And the pain that some people felt to be said, hey, you're part of our family, we love you, we care about you, but then totally ignore what's going on here, whether because it feels too political or too socially liberal or whatever it might be. But that, and it's not just an Asian American thing, but any of us.
Yes, yeah.
Because you already feel like you don't belong.
Yeah.
But to not hear anything. And again, we can overestimate just like the public statements, but I think it makes a difference. I mean, you're a preacher, Pastor, so you recognize this. Our words have authority. What we say from up front, in many ways dictates what people will feel to be true, whether that's fair or not. So I might be going into territory that you can edit out later if you need to.
Okay.
But some of the anger that some people feel is directly tying, and some people don't believe there's any tie at all, when you've heard for a year Kung flu,
right,
or Chinese virus,
right,
from not only the most powerful voices in the land, but church leaders,
right,
that makes a statement. And people are sheep, and that's not meant to be derogatory.
Right.
But people will be emboldened by what they hear their leaders say or not say. And that's one of the things that gets me really angry. Is you hear people plenty vocal about Chinese virus and Kung flu, but then don't want to make a statement about when something happens where a majority of Asian women are murdered. Because, it's not really about race. People are listening. People sense those things. So in our church, for instance, at the Village, I would say our minority populations are probably, say, African American or Latino, Latinx. But we have consciously, again, there's a slippery slope. You can't address everything. But when there have been things that have happened in the larger Black community, in my paradigm is I'm thinking about that brother or sister in our church who are wondering, does anyone in my church actually give a rip about this? And just saying a statement, it is what it is, but to acknowledge it. When there were shootings of migrants, making a clear statement for us to say this is evil, demonic, and vile. And I remember a couple of members of our church after that, really, they had said they were coming into church feeling like just that weight of being a foreigner and everyone looking at them suspiciously. And to hear their church acknowledge that, even though they're probably the minority in our congregation, I think there's a certain responsibility that the gospel compels us to think of those who might not have the largest voice in our respective communities.
Wow. Man, Pastor Dan, I really appreciate you taking the time to share this. I know that it's not easy all the time to talk about it, even though you speak about it so well and you give us such vivid stories and insight into the Asian American culture here in the United States, man. I'm just grateful for you being willing to sit down and have this conversation with me. Man, I think you said a lot of things that have challenged me personally, and I think you've said some things that will challenge our church, and hopefully the listeners will be challenged to think about this subject a little bit more in the upcoming days, especially as these conversations continue to happen, especially regarding the tragic events that happened a few weeks ago in Atlanta, man. So thank you so much for sitting down to talk with us. We appreciate it. Look forward to following up with you, and hopefully we'll hear from you at church more on it. And hopefully we'll have an Ethnos coming up pretty soon. We'll be able to have some more conversation about racial reconciliation and justice and things of the light.
Amen. Amen. Well, I
Yeah.
appreciate you having me here, brother. I'm honored.
Thank you, Pastor Dan. Thank you for listening. We really appreciate you, Freedom Church. And we will talk to you soon on the next time we need to talk.